I'm Corey Astle.
And I'm Kyle Salmon.
Welcome to Conservative Minds, a podcast dedicated to examining conservative intellectual history to determine the core values of American conservatism. What does it mean to call yourself a conservative? What did it mean in prior times, and how did we get where we are today? We explore these questions and more by turning to conservative political thinkers from the past and the present. Each episode, we select readings and conduct a discussion to share with you our investigation. If you want to join the discussion, like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at ConsMinds, ConsMinds. For episode 36, we read Liberalism by Ludwig von Mises, published in 1927.
Ludwig von Mises was born in 1881 in Lviv, in what is now Ukraine, and is best known for his contribution to liberalism and economic theory and his belief in the power of the consumer. Von Mises earned his doctorate in law and economics from the University of Vienna in 1906 and was a professor there from 1913 to 1938. In 1926, he founded the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. His most influential student, Friedrich Hayek, also became a well-known author in the field. Von Mises fled the Nazis in 1940, coming to America, where he taught at New York University from 1945 to 1969. His work was a strong influence on the 20th century libertarian movement in America. He died October 10th, 1973, in New York City.
All right, so this book is called Liberalism, but we should say at the outset that liberalism had a different definition back in 1927 than what it's come to be understood as today. And so what does it mean to von Mises? Well, he opens the book by saying, liberalism is not a completed doctrine or a fixed dogma. On the contrary, it is the application of the teachings of science to the social life of man. Liberalism concerns itself exclusively with man's material well-being, and the advancement of outward material welfare does not concern itself with the inner spiritual and metaphysical needs. So it doesn't promise men happiness and contentment, he says, but only the most abundant possible satisfaction of all those desires that can be satisfied by the things of the outer world. And I think what he means there is basically by consumption. And in 1927, consumption means something different than it does today, where you had a lot of people who are actually pretty poor, even in America and in Europe, where there were a lot of folks who were just scraping by. He says, a society in which liberal principles are put into effect is usually called a capitalist society. So in this preface, he tells us that liberalism and capitalism are essentially the same thing, although he says it's different, but he's not super specific about how it's different, although maybe Kyle, you can chime in on that. But
no, I thought the same. I thought he says they're different, but they always seem to occur together. So maybe capitalism is the effect of liberalism on the economy, but it's basically ends up being part of the same system.
So I think, taking from that we can kind of understand what he means by liberalism is basically the free market and, a capitalist system. And we'll see that he contrasts that to socialism in just a second here. So he says, all that has created the wealth of our time can be traced back to capitalist institutions. I think there's a lot of truth to that, just as my own commentary. And allows us to enjoy a standard of living far above that which just a few generations ago, he says, was possible only to the rich and especially privileged. And this is something that we've seemed to have forgotten. So he sets up the comparison, liberalism versus socialism, the two different systems of human cooperation, he says. Number one, liberalism or capitalism is based on the private ownership of the means of production, and socialism is the communal ownership of the means of production. And he'll argue that the only workable system of human cooperation is private ownership of the means of production. The program of liberalism, condensed into a single word, is property, so private ownership of the means of production. And I think this is enlightening for us today because there's such an active debate, again, it's almost unbelievable, but in our lifetime, as to whether we should ditch capitalism and turn to socialism. And it just would be, completely nonsensical to a guy like von Mises, who saw this personally, very close at hand. What's the difference between having private property? So, I think what it tells us too is liberalism definition has changed over the last 100 years. Certainly socialism, the definition has changed too, because I don't think these spoiled Generation Yers are actually serious about losing their phones and having to stand in lines in order to get bread.
No, that's the weird thing about it too. They use the same word, but if you talk about those. So we should nationalize all the factories and everything. No, no, it's not it. Well, okay. What do you mean then? Right? And it's confusing. I thought what interesting in that introduction was von Mises says that liberalism is the first political movement that sought universal benefits to mankind,
Mm,
not just special privileges to its adherents.
yeah.
It's the first sort of. Well, I mean, I guess that's because it grew out of the Enlightenment when men were starting to think of universal ideas that could benefit everyone and not just the sort of ad hoc arrangements that led to kingdoms and tribes in the past. He also says that socialism has the same aim. They also want universal benefits to mankind, at least if you listen to their theories. Just the means they want to achieve it with are the complete opposite of the way liberalism wants to achieve it. And one of the conflicts that he was seeing in his time was, the socialists will promise everything. We're going
Yeah.
to remake society. We're going to make it great.
Free everything.
Everything for free. Yeah. I mean, we see it in the election campaign going on now. And then liberals say, well, that won't work, or there's not enough money to pay for that. Then it's like, well, you're heartless. You don't care about the people. You're only interested in keeping what you have. And it really made me think of Thomas Sowell's constrained vision and unconstrained visions
Hmm.
that we talked about in episode 23. It's just that, like, here you have two groups of people who really want the same thing. They want universal equality and raising of society's standards economically and legally, but just such very different ways of doing it. And as von Mises tells us, only one of them actually can work.
Yeah. Yeah. He says socialists say equality before the law is not enough. Well, that's an echo that we hear today. I mean, it's not
Mhm.
enough to be equal before the law. And he says you must also guarantee the same income. We must also guarantee the same outcomes. Back to the soul's visions. He says it's not enough to abolish privileges of birth and rank. You got to do away with private property also. But he pushes back and says it's only because inequality of wealth is possible in our social order, only because it stimulates everyone to produce as much as he can and at the lowest cost, does mankind today have at its disposal the total annual wealth now available for consumption. In other words, I mean, this is a little bit what we hear from Nietzsche too, which is you need those people who want to stand above and want to be better than in order to get ahead and have this self-interest motivation. Again, a conversation we've had over and over again is that yeah, you can have equality of outcomes, but only by smashing those people who are at the top. You got to level, you got to flatten, and we're seeing that today in 100 different contexts. In California, they want to eliminate math tests because instead we should just grade kids on their effort. At
Hmm.
Harvard, they don't want so many Asians. So what we got to do is is change the criteria. They don't want so many Asians in the Stuyvesant High School in New York. So let's get rid of the test, and instead we'll just, in other words, those people who are competing and doing well, the only way to level, or the only way to create the absolute equality, is to level from the top down.
Yeah, just think about the result you want and figure out a system that gets you that instead of you know, anything that's real or based on nature. Yeah, it's in that way you can really see the opposite. Is where the liberal in von Mises' definition of the term was. He doesn't talk a lot about natural law, but that's kind of what he's saying is that it's really concentrating on what is. Equality under the law. He says is an absolute that every society should have, but equality in results is basically just ignoring reality.
Yeah, yeah. He says specifically, nothing is as ill-founded as the alleged equality of all humans, because men are altogether unequal, even between brothers. Again, like we had this discussion in the end of history, quoting Nietzsche. But this really jumped out to me because he's talking about the resentment that's created and sort of as the engine that fuels kind of the socialist desire for absolute outcome equality. He says resentment is at work when one so hates somebody for his more favorable circumstances that one is prepared to bear heavy losses if only the hated might also come to harm. In
Yeah.
other words, look, I'm willing to stand in a 2-hour line to get bread just so long as I know that those SOBs are not making, big money. Those, corporate titans or whatever, or hedge fund managers, or even worse is like any Republican who's doing well.
Yeah. But I think that's he kind of when he describes liberalism as a limited philosophy, as one that's only concerned with the material, I think he's kind of foreshadowing what is the problem with it, or why any alternative besides it would seem appealing to people. Because when you do have that socialist thing, they've got a theory of everything. That this is going to fix everything,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the kind of neurosis that he talks about in the introduction. And I thought that was kind of funny because you see memes like that today talking about socialism as a mental disorder, and here he is saying basically the same
Yeah.
thing in 1928 or whatever this was. But I think it shows a flaw in liberalism that we've discussed on previous episodes too. Is it isn't fulfilling necessarily. I mean,
Yeah.
there needs to be something else. Um, whether that be religion or community or any of the other, nationalism, even any of the various things that fill that gap that make men and women feel like they're part of something and striving towards a goal together. And liberalism doesn't do that, and von Mises doesn't seem to want us to do that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that hole leaves a gap that gets often filled with things like socialism and fascism, which was rising in his time.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get a better kind of description and more insights into this question, next week when we read Deneen. But I was really interested in von Mises's conversation about religion, and he says liberalism and religion could both exist without their spheres touching, but liberalism did not intrude into the domain of religious faith or metaphysical doctrine. In fact, he says the opposite, that it encountered the church as a political power claiming the right to regulate, according to its judgment, not only the relationship of man to the world to come, but also the affairs of this world. It was at this point that the battle lines had to be drawn. So, to your point, he says in multiple places, like liberalism is not well equipped to create happiness or contentment in human beings. And that's the sphere of religion, that's the sphere of family, and it has nothing to do with us, in liberalism. And in fact, our spheres are so separate that only when religion intrudes upon liberalism is when they
Right.
cross. But I think that there's a weakness in that argument, and again, I think Deneen is really going to discuss this next week. But because what we're facing is he basically wants to say that liberalism is value neutral, and I think we want it to be value neutral, but in fact, it's not necessarily, because when we read the Carlson book on family, he points to some of the problems here. Like, you and I are big fans of free market, and we're going to tout that till our dying day. But there is some downsides, and that is like it atomizes people. The
Mm-hmm.
consumption atomizes people. The work, you're no longer working together towards a common purpose. Instead, I go off to this job, my wife goes off to the other job. In society, we become less and less tight knit and cooperative and tied together as a community, and that has psychological effects for individuals and sociological effects for society, and so it's not actually value neutral. So it's not entirely true. And I want to hear what you have to say about this, but I didn't think he gave us the best argument that religion is what's intruding upon liberalism, because I mean, I think liberalism, I mean, it's capitalism, and the free market also intrudes upon religion in that it tears families apart and makes people like less. You have to fight against that, and yes, you have the upside of an enlightened society, enlightenment, post enlightenment society, is that we have individual choice and ability to kind of chart our own course, and I think that's a massive blessing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But it does come at a cost. So,
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, I don't think he was picturing a society as secular as the one we live in now. So,
yeah, that's
so
true.
maybe coming when liberalism was rising in the Enlightenment period, maybe I would say a lot of its opposition came from established churches, be they Catholic or Protestant, who were had a position in society and a view of how it should be ordered. And now you have these radicals coming out of the French Revolution and later the 1848 revolutions that wanted to take away the special privileges of the church and the nobility and make everybody equal, which is what he talks about liberalism doing. And that's why it's a great fit for America, because we already
Yeah,
were into that. We didn't have an established church, not really. in the colonial era, and we didn't have nobility here. They had them back in England, but they didn't really send them over here. So it fit us great. But I could see that there would be significant resistance in Europe, and he was probably, I think, still feeling that. He doesn't really say anything specific that religion does that's bad. I think it's more about the class privileges and the limitations on individual freedom
Uh-huh.
that a heavy church hand in a state would present. But I kind of wish he'd gone a little more into that because it kind of comes out at the end. We're just in a few little spots. It was a little bit in chapter one, and then he brings it up again towards the end.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
one
that's
one
right.
cannot permit the peace to be disturbed by priests and fanatics. And then moves
Yeah.
on. They're like, well, you're gonna. I wish you'd break that down a little because there's fanatics and there's fanatics. I mean,
Yeah.
a fanatical priest in our 21st century America isn't usually calling for us all to submit to the Pope. It's usually just wanting people to go to church on Sunday, you know,
Yeah.
follow a few of the rules. So it's I wondered at that, but I wonder how much of it is just the influence of his times.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And so at the end, like you said, that he bounces around with this a little bit, but in the end, he comes back to it and says, liberalism does not try to explain the cosmos or say anything about the meaning and purpose of the human existence. It seeks to give men only one thing: the peaceful, undisturbed development of material well being for all.
Mm-hmm.
We're not trying to answer any questions. You answer those questions on your own. I mean, I think that in our reading, the late great Milton Friedman, he says this, I guess, plainer language. It's basically like whatever you want to do with your life, spiritually or emotionally, or that's up to you. All we're saying is we want to give as much freedom to individuals as we possibly can. And von Mises is kind of foreshadowing that we just want to let people have the peaceful, undisturbed development of their material well-being. We just want to let them go to work and get ahead if they want to, and give people opportunities to just have more fulfilling life than just cleaning your clothes and churning butter.
I think that's a great vision for what a lot of conservatives would want out of their government. Just keep the peace, protect lives and liberty and property, and then just leave me alone. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's still, you could see why he was influential on the libertarian movement when it developed in the 60s and 70s, because
Yeah.
that's really right. That's what they want, and that's all they want. And I think even for a lot of conservatives, we don't want much more than that. Even to the extent we want a more uh, virtue seeking state. I think it still makes us a little uncomfortable to even say that. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, let's highlight that a little bit, Cal, because I think we're in a few weeks we're going to read a book that tries to delineate the difference between conservatism and libertarianism. But I think you put your finger on a big piece of it, which is that for libertarians, they want to go as far as basically the Lockean vision, you know, individuals who are autonomous, and going back to our reading of Randy Barnett and his vision of the Constitution, the only law that we need is to keep people from harming one another or harming one another's property. And then that's it. We don't need any government besides that. We'll have, insurance schemes that
right,
that can handle all other human interactions. Where conservatives are like, there is more to life than just consumption, and humans actually do need to have families and Hazoni last week, tribes. We have to feel like we belong, that we're part of something, and our associations are actually far more important than our logical positions on policy when it comes to how we make decisions in the world and stuff like that. And so
yeah. And I wonder if it's when Lockean ideas were getting started. I don't. Maybe it's those relationships were so ingrained into people that they didn't think they could lose them. So
yeah,
maybe that's why Locke didn't address it, and von Mises doesn't really address that. And even later with Hayek and Rand, they don't. Or Friedman, I don't think they see the problem of greater individual rights. And then when that becomes more accepted and becomes the norm and becomes the highest good in a lot of systems, only now, even are we starting to say, well, maybe we need something else also to balance that. That
yeah,
these,
that's a great point.
I didn't think of that when I was reading it, but when what you were saying made me kind of think. It's it's so much a part of who we are, the family, the tribe, the nation, that it's hard for people to think of not having one.
Yeah. Well, I'd kind of like to return a little bit to his conversation about Marxism and socialism because he spends a good bit of chapters, a little bit of chapter one, but a lot of chapter four on this. But he says science demonstrated the absurdity of the policy the Marxists wished to recommend, so they sought to invalidate logic and science. Marxists simply declare without evidence that the coming of socialism is inevitable. And he'll say what was proved by science theoretically was corroborated in practice by the failure of all socialist experiments. I think that this is so prescient, what he wrote here, because he's not only saying that social science and economics and all of human learning proved in basically every way possible that the Marxist vision is not possible and it doesn't work, just flatly. It's a dead end. So he says instead of fighting that, continuing to fight that same battle of no, a planned economy actually does work okay. They just moved beyond that and said, no, it's logic and science. That's just the tool. Well, what we'll say now, what they'll these late Marxists will say is logic and science. Those are tools of the oppressor.
Mhm.
That's the tools of white privilege that keep other people down. And I just think that it's just amazing that in 1927 he kind of identified that, and that is the new wave of Marxism today, is to say, well, it's the test. The test is what is racist or whatever, or is a tool of privilege and oppression. And so what we need to do is eliminate all tests and logic and science. Science was created by the oppressor to keep the people, keep the oppressed down. And in 1927, he identified that, and that's as an active a conversation in the leftist academy as anything.
It is, yeah, it's really impressive because socialism had only been going in any country for about a decade when he wrote. So there were, I mean, right away there were some failures and they had to change things. So maybe that indicated to him proof, but he didn't have all the proof we have today, where it's
Yeah,
failed everywhere.
right. Yeah,
So that's even more really insightful to look at this and say it can't work, and I already know why even before the experiments performed. Yeah,
hmm,
but you're right. They, instead of, I mean, it's become a cult of anti-reason
yeah.
and just yeah. I mean, he calls it neurosis, and I think that's about right.
We can't win on logic and science, so we need to fight against logic and science and instead say that it's my experience. That's
Hmm.
that's what it's moved to. Is it's the level of absurdity is it's just makes your head spin. But logic and science, that's the tool of the oppressor. So we need to move on and say no, it's my experience as a intersectional whatever, this and that identity. So anyway, he foresaw that. While at the same time, to your point, like he was alive and observing the Bolshevik Revolution, but he didn't see the fall of communism in 1989, or the fall of the Soviet Union,
Hmm.
the Berlin Wall fall and everything. But saw it coming and predicted it, and everything he said about capitalism, about the free market, has essentially come to pass. So it's pretty amazing. And I also think really enjoyed his discussion about collectivism on the right, because he says there's not only the leftist collectivism, but also the collectivism on the right is the enemy of liberalism. And what he's talking about is sort of the fascist, and we've talked about this with other books, but he says the doctrine of class antagonisms and of class conflict is accepted by the nationalist parties as well as the Marxists. Now, we had a conversation about nationalism last week with Hazoni, and of course, Hazoni had his own, definition of nationalism that was interesting, and we played with it in our hands a little bit. But I think von Mises is referring to kind of more traditional understanding of what nationalist is. Sort of the far right or well, it's not far right. It's a collectivist right, and this is also before Nazi Germany too in 1927. But he'll say what distinguishes nationalists from the Marxist parties is only that they wish to overcome class conflict by reverting to a status society constituted along the lines that they recommend. Well, and for Nazis, obviously, it was what they recommended was a Aryan race of Germans at the head of an international order. I think we fight against this around the world today as well, because the collectivist right wants to, unlike, they don't want to level like Marxists, but they do want to have tiers of more equal, though, just the same as the Marxists would. And it's just, I thought it was pretty prescient and interesting that that he raised this and had this discussion in 1927.
Yeah, and I think you can tell he doesn't really think much of. I mean, he gives socialists credit for having an idea, and then says that the way they go about it is completely wrong, and a lot of the ideas that follow from their idea are wrong. But it's an ideology. But fascism, he says that, they oppose socialists, but they don't really offer a counter argument to socialism. And a lot, like you were saying, a lot of what they're saying is the same stuff. It's just
Yeah.
who's the out group and who's the in group. I mean,
Yeah.
they oppose socialists and they want to fight them in the streets, like what was going on in Germany and Austria and a bunch of places in Europe in those days, where political parties had kind of have irregular militias who would attend their events and they'd fight each other. A much bigger version of that Antifa Proud Boys fight that goes on in Portland every so often. Here they were doing it on a grander scale in those days. But the fascists mostly were in it because they like violence. I mean, their ideas weren't really. It was just they don't like socialists. They don't like what socialists were doing, and they're going to fight them because the socialists were fighting. And von Mises is looking at this and saying, "What is it even? It's not. It doesn't offer any solution. It's just street mobs."
Yeah, right. But he says they still want interventionism in the place of capitalism. In
Yeah.
other words, they still want government control. It's just kind of the fascist vision is the nationalist vision is the society will almost work like a corporation. I mean, this is what you see in China, right? I mean, you see China acts as like a corporation where you have a head, and which is the president and the party, and the means of production are still owned by. It's semi-private, but still heavily controlled, if not owned, by the government and basically directed by the government. So you have more of a free market element that you don't have in a communist society, but it's still directed by a despot or whatever, the president.
Yeah, I thought his I mean, to speak of violence, I think when he talks about democracy, it's interesting because I don't think he believes it's necessarily good in itself, except that it's the only way to get governments to change their policies without violence. So when he talks, but he gets into kind of a discussion of the fact that just because we elect people, it doesn't mean they're good, and it doesn't mean they're going to be liberal either. Even if they're elected by liberals, the people have to keep the pressure on them to be liberal, and that when there is a flaw in democracy, it leads a lot of the socialist and fascist parties to say, see, democracy is crooked. You can't just go on who has the most votes. You have to have the best people in office. And that happens to be us. And because it always happens to be them, right? And I thought that was good because he said that Democrats also believe we should have the best people in office. But how do you figure out who's best? Well, you vote for it. And I said, well, really, it's a simple point, but it seemed like a good one to me because it was an elegant kind of proof. I thought that.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, yeah, we want the best too. And how do you decide when there's millions of us? How do you decide what's the opinion of millions of people? Well, it's an election, so that's really the only way to do it. So it was sort of it was like the Churchill quote, I think it was, about how democracy is the worst system except for all the other systems.
Yeah. Because you can see the common thread between fascism and Marxism, as far as you still have a dictator at the head, and you still have people who are more equal than others. It's just that and I guess Marxists will say that we're all equal, but in fact they're not. And the nationalists would say, no, there are people who should be at the head, and that's us. and the rest are second tier or whatever. So he says, he goes on to say, when comparing these two and calling them both collectivism on the right and on the left as enemies of liberalism, he says society cannot, in the long run, exist if it is divided into sharply defined groups, each intent on wresting special privileges for its own members. All anti-liberal parties want nothing but to secure special favors for their own members in complete disregard of the resulting disintegration of the whole structure of society. I think this is the reason that I have such a problem with identity politics.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that it's just easy to see that, as he said, society in the long run it can't survive. If we're going to divide into groups based on whatever, maybe it's a physical characteristic feature or otherwise, I think in the long run it's just bad. It's bad for us, and it's going to lead to bad places. There's really a lot to learn from a von Mises who's writing in the 20s, and then probably my guess is his next books in the 30s are probably just as interesting, if not more so, because these grand debates about big ideologies were so alive at that time, and now they're so alive
Yeah.
again, amazingly,
It,
sadly.
it maybe it's shocking, and then maybe it's, you always want to say it's lack of education when somebody doesn't see your own way, but of course they say that about us too, you know. So
Sure.
it's, I don't know what the answer is, but it is strange to read a 100-year-old book and read the same fights that are going on today. It's a little disheartening because we should each have more evidence on our side and be able to sort these things out better by now.
I was going to say he doesn't really give us an answer how to
Yeah,
how to
right.
resolve the divisiveness. He just takes the bludgeon and says no, liberalism is better, and collectivism on the right and left. So which is probably something you and I would agree with, but still, that's not how you persuade. So I don't know. I was hoping as I was reading along, like, oh yeah, tell us, what was the answers, and basically he didn't. He's like, just stick with what we know works, which I can't.
Yeah, it was a very practical argument because, I mean, when he talked about why everyone should be equal under the law, I thought it was going to be, a sort of like we all emerged from nature, the sort of Lockean equality. But it was more like, no, look, it's the only one that works.
Yeah, yeah.
It makes people work hard, and if you have an underclass, they're going to rebel. So really, we shouldn't have one. Which is, those are practical concerns to be sure. I mean, he's right. If you have class privileges, then the people who don't have the privilege are going to be resentful, and they're eventually it's going to blow up.
Uh-huh.
But that doesn't feel like a principle so much as just a fact of life. As though if those two things weren't true, he wouldn't mind it. But these are the inevitable results of a class society, so we have to be classless because it's the only thing that works.
Yeah, yeah.
So I mean that's a fair argument, but it's just it wasn't what I was expecting either.
Yeah, he doesn't have that deep sort of ideological position. And even when he's introducing us to the idea of liberalism, he doesn't go back to first principles or anything. He doesn't even attempt any first principles. To your point, and as you say that, that's right. He doesn't start with first principles and then build upon that. Instead, he just is in midstream saying, "Hey, look, guys, look, however we got here, it's working. So let's stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
This is smart."
I was expecting some Aristotle because they always have some Aristotle,
Yeah, right.
but there wasn't, and
Yeah, yeah.
that's okay. Maybe he figured enough guys have written about Aristotle, but it was a very practical politics look at why we should have equality under law.
All right, so he does gives us some seeds of the contemporary meaning of liberalism in his discussion of tolerance, and I don't know if this caught your eye. He says liberalism must be, first of all, tell me if this is something you've heard before. Liberalism must be intolerant of every kind of intolerance. One cannot
Yeah,
permit the peace to be disturbed. And you quoted this part, disturbed by priests and fanatics. But the liberalism must be intolerant of every kind of intolerance, which I think is the reason, part of the reason where we are today with Trump, because it's kind of like every action has an equal reaction in the universe or whatever. We're just with my son at the World Series, and the Nationals are the world champions. But at the World Series game, which we're so excited about, but Trump was there. He was at Game 5, which we were at, and the level of just vitriol in the crowd of just booing him so hard. Look, I'm not going to get into the question of Trump, but I will say, like, I it's sad. And my son is 11 years old. He looks at me and he says, "Wow, these people really hate Trump, don't they?" And I was like, "Yeah, I don't agree with that level of." But I think that's von Mises has kind of told us what is the source of that level of just vitriol that's turning us all into rude and I don't know, just inappropriate behavior for adults to boo like that. I think, but I guess it comes from a place of we got to be intolerant of every kind of intolerance, and we think that Trump is intolerant, and we've got to just push back with everything because he doesn't deserve civility of any sort. It's like we got to fight back with everything we have, and if he brings a knife, and we got to bring a bazooka or whatever to push back. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, as a Philadelphian, I'm more tolerant of booing. So,
Yeah.
so and I mean, I remember booing the mayor here once. So there is, but I think I see what the connection you're making. I hadn't thought of that, but it's true. That can overwhelm tolerance itself. That anti-tolerant, or intolerant, or anti-intolerant, however you want to call it, can run away with it because it lets you you identify an other as those are the intolerant people over there, so we have to be intolerant to them. But then I think, I mean, to your point, that if you draw that too broadly, then you're basically calling everyone intolerant, and then you're kind of getting toward the class privilege rule by the best men that von Mises is warning against, and saying that liberalism actually isn't. So I think balancing these two requires some good judgment. He talked about how we shouldn't treat government officials as though they're, above the rest of us, that it's a noble work. He says there's no rational basis for the overestimation of the activities carried on in the offices of administrative authorities. It's a form of atavism, a vestige from the days when the burgher had to fear the prince and his knights, because at any moment he might be spoliated by them. He's right. I think sometimes, and it's usually when it's the guy we like is president, we say, you got to respect the office, and it's, you shouldn't. I think sometimes a politician ought to get booed.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, in DC, I think some of them go a little overboard with their hatred of the president. I don't think you should hate anybody, but a boo now and then should remind somebody that he's just a person serving in an office.
That's true. I guess in Philadelphia, you guys boo Santa Claus.
Yeah, we get that a lot.
All right. Well, I think that we've basically covered it. What's your final thoughts on von Mises?
I like this book. I thought it was it's a translation from the 60s. I'm not sure if he translated it or somebody else did, but it's very clear. Sometimes when you read the more philosophical books, there are sentences you have to go back and look at 3 or 4 times to see what the guy's talking about. I didn't find that with von Mises. I thought it was a very clear explanation of what a liberal is, and if not necessarily the first causes of liberalism, but it's certainly how it should be in his view, and what kind of a limited vision it is, and why it should work. So I think if you're interested in that tradition that runs from Locke to Friedman, this is definitely in the middle of that, and it's worth that it's a good read for that.
Yeah, and you can see where Hayek got some of his thinking from, and I think you're right that again this isn't an original sort of back to first principles to figure out the world. Instead, it reads a lot more like an essay where you're picking up where we are and making a strong argument for liberalism, but really for the free market and for capitalism. And I think I've been a little critical of a few things that he said, but overall I love it because again, like you know how big of a fan I am of Milton Friedman, and I just wish we had a von Mises or a Friedman today to really push back on a lot of this, because I think I think that we have more of a tendency to want to duck and cover rather than pushing back and say, no, this is actually really great what the free market has done for us. We don't want to lose sight of that. So that's von Mises. Next time, we're going to read a book called Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen, published in 2018. It's just a year or two old, and I found this book to be super interesting. So hopefully the podcast will be interesting next week too. Catch us then. Thanks.